Hello and welcome back to Carpe Historia. I hope you're all having a lovely cosy autumn. Today, for this channel's third video, I've decided to do something a little more in keeping with the season, coming up to Halloween and Samhain for those of a pagan disposition. Today I'm going to be covering a short story of Sybil Leek, a local to me witch, who grew to have international fame towards the end of her life. So without further ado, the story of Sybil Leek. Sybil was born in Staffordshire in 1917, and from a very young age she was made very aware and rightfully very proud of her family's rich heritage in witchcraft. Sybil even claimed that she was related to the infamous witch Molly Lee, who, in fairness, seems to have practiced a lot of midwifery and had a pet jackdaw, so at the time she must have been a witch, absolutely. That's definitely what a witch is, a midwife who has a pet. They were so afraid of Sybil's ancestor at the time that, unfortunately, when she died, she was actually buried on the outskirts of a cemetery, facing the wrong way, which was a big deal back then, and perhaps most unfortunately, they buried her still alive pet jackdaw with her. And they wouldn't let any of her fellow witches or friends actually erect a tombstone. And when they were denied that, the local witches supposedly dragged their altar stone from their meeting place, which was a long distance away, and put it over her grave, and nobody has dared move it since. And Molly is still the subject of a lot of ghost stories, so there's so much fear surrounding her, even all these centuries later. And unfortunately, the sort of persecution she faced is something that her descendant, Sybil, would have to face centuries later. Sybil seems to have had a really interesting childhood. One of the visitors to her house was Aleister Crowley, who was an infamous occultist and is still very well known today. And he was actually the subject of a Black Sabbath song, so very famous. And her education was led by a former star of the Russian opera. As a young woman, Sybil spent much time living with some local gypsies, and she formed lifelong bonds, learning as much as possible and becoming really accepted by them. She was even a businesswoman at a very young age. She actually opened up antique shops in Ringwood, Somerset, and, where we will lay the rest of our story, in Burley. The village of Burley is tiny, but it is picturesque, and there are nearby Bronze Age burial mounds which suggest the roots of Burley and its people are really ancient. The local pub has been linked to smuggling, and recently a secret cellar was even discovered in which weapons and treasures were found. Horses from the forest are allowed to roam free and often pass through the village, much to the bewilderment of tourists and sometimes the swearing of drivers. Sybil really threw herself into her new life in the New Forest. She became High Priestess of the local Horsa Coven and even began reporting on the New Forest as a journalist. Sybil's fame soon grew, particularly after she outwardly said that she was indeed a witch. And back in those days, that was a massive deal. I mean, let's not forget this was very soon after the repeal of the witchcraft laws in the UK. And there were a series of laws, one of which meant witchcraft was punishable by death, one of which meant that, witchcraft was a punishable offence, whatever that means. And, things only started to soften in the 1950s. So that was right around the time that Sybil was active as, an out and proud witch. So it was still very difficult. And the fact that she wandered around town in the New Forest with a cape on and a jackdaw on her shoulder, which, by the way, very cute. His name was Mr. Hotfoot Jackson. Those things didn't help matters, although more power to her. It just made the villagers and the world's suspicions of her more profound. As news of the White Witch spread, Sybil became something of a media personality, and people would come from all around the world to ask for guidance and healing and advice. And Sybil's book, The Diary of a Witch, actually says that rarely one night would go past in which people didn't knock on her door or call her in the middle of the night seeking her help. It must have been tough. But with the increase in Sybil's fame came an increase in tourists. And by that, I mean coaches and coaches and coaches of tourists to this tiny little village that did not have the infrastructure or the will to sustain them. And that brought many issues for Sybil. In fact, it brought a lot of issues with the local population in general. She describes one Halloween night, where local students actually staked out her house to try and find out what she was going to be doing for Halloween, obviously as a witch, big night of the year. And she ended up having to be smuggled out of the house by her husband and sons, one of whom had actually made a dummy to put in the window to try and throw the students off. So it was quite dark at this point for her. One of perhaps the best stories I uncovered about Sybil Leek, and this may just be a story, it may just be a rumour, but it is everywhere when you Google Sybil Leek, is that she was supposedly recruited by the British government during World War II in order to provide fake horoscopes to the deputy leader of the Nazi Party, Rudolf Hess, in order to lure him back to the UK. As Sybil's fame grew through television interviews and other means, people began to take a more commercial interest in living in the witchcraft village. Soon, and as can be seen today, witchcraft shops would pop up all over town, selling everything from spells to jewellery, all related to witches. The only shop that really seems to have not had anything witchcraft related was Sybil's own antique shop at the time. Apparently, she completely refused to sell anything witchy related. She wanted to stay true to her passion for antiques. Sybil's life, however, was about to take quite a dramatic turn. Not only did she have people knocking on her door day and night, giving her phone calls, she also now had to face eviction. The local postmaster, who was her landlord, had served her an eviction notice. By her own words, apparently he was fed up with the amount of disruption to his life and, all the people wanting to know more about witchcraft. He resented it. So he served her the eviction notice. She obviously begged him to reconsider. And he said the only circumstances under which he would reconsider, and I quote, was if she denounced witchcraft. These events led to a monumental decision for Sybil and her family. They decided to uproot and actually move to America to escape the press frenzy and the persecution that she was currently facing in the New Forest, which for a lover of the New Forest who had been reporting on its history and the news there for so many years must have been a huge wrench. When Sybil reached America, it's probably not fair to say that she had a more relaxing time of it, but she was certainly able to carry out her journalism, her media appearances, and her practices in relative peace. Sybil really did well for herself in America. Many now credit her for the explosion in popularity of witchcraft in North America, and her son even set up a research centre dedicated to the memory of his mother. Sybil seems to have somewhat of a divided legacy. I was really surprised when I went to Burley recently because, I've been there many, many times before, but this time I was going specifically to ask questions about Sybil and do research for this episode. And yet there was still such a divided opinion about her. On one hand, and this was the majority, people seemed to see her as this groundbreaking witch, the one that, led the way for witchcraft to be accepted by wider society. But I was actually told to F off by one person in particular, who told me he wanted nothing more to do with Sybil Leek, her legacy or her witchcraft. I found that quite upsetting because it made me realise that Sybil isn't so different from her ancestor. Sybil, like all the witches before her and all those accused of witchcraft, were still persecuted. They were hounded. They were harassed for their beliefs because they lived in a world that didn't yet accept them. I'm not so certain that we live in a world that accepts them fully today, but certainly not back then. Today, Sybil's books are so sought after and so rare that the witch that I actually borrowed the books on to do the research for this episode said they were her most prized possession, and I think that speaks volumes.